Bungalow, Range and Mel here, back with another Bettong Bungalow. Today I'm sharing with you the story of what happens when wetlands are under attack from severe bushfires, with a pretty inspiring outcome. This story takes place on Yuin country near Braidwood, but I caught up with my guest on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, next to some reeds at the Queanbeyan River, to the backdrop of some very noisy cockatoos. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects today to all the elders past, present and emerging who have looked after these different waterways across the three nations, and really thank them for caring for our land. Donna Hazel is a senior ecologist for the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust and works with private landholders who are interested in protecting the environment on their properties. Donna also owns a property in Braidwood, which has in it a type of wetlands known as a chain of ponds and a swampy meadow, kind of like a moist, hydrated floodplain. The property came under fire in 2019-2020 during the Black Summer bushfires, and the flames came right down into that swampy meadow. So come with me, take a seat next to the reeds next to the Queanbeyan River, and let Donna tell us the story of what happened when the bushfires hit on the 10th of January 2020.
We'd been on high alert for months actually with the Black Range fire, but it was actually the Currawin fire that came up from Currawin Creek that came from the north, jumped to the Bungalow River and entered our property and burnt into our swampy meadow and chain of ponds system. And the impact that wetland system had on the fire, but also the impact the fire had on the wetland system and the way it recovered from that, I found to be really quite fascinating, and a real example of the resilience that these sorts of systems can have against these increasing examples of extreme events like bushfire. And it really sort of brought home to me the value of having these systems in the environment.
And so looking at these photos here that are coming up on the screen, so tell us about the fire came roaring through. Yep. But then you can see it almost seems to have stopped.
Yes, so the resilience of this type of wetland system to an event like bushfires really comes from the presence of the water, but it's not in the permanent ponds that you can see in this system so much. It's more about the water that's in the soil and the water that's in the vegetation. Often when we think about fire and that fire triangle of the three elements that the fire needs to occur, which is your fuel, your oxygen and your heat, we often think of vegetation as being the fuel, and it makes the fire and it's a problem. But in the case of this kind of wetland system, the vegetation is actually not just fuel. It contains lots of water, and in fact it reduces the heat in the fire. And what we saw with the fire coming across our swampy meadow was that the fire was reduced in intensity, and in fact it stopped, and it left patches unburnt, and it allowed the fire to be put out at that point.
So the phragmites that you had, the ones sitting, very similar to the ones here behind us, did they survive, or were they just little piles of ash?
Well, they were in fact piles of ash, and I thought that we'd lost it. We had some lovely big areas of phragmites through the wetland system, but within a matter of weeks they were recovering.
And so now are they over your head again?
Yes, they are well and truly, and providing habitat for birds like the reed warblers.
And so during that time, do you see the wetlands then as creating resources for wildlife? What sort of things happen for the wildlife while the fires are happening during the fire and post-fire? What resources does that wetland chain of ponds give you?
Yes, so as the fire's moving through, you've got wildlife that's sort of moving and trying to escape. Yes. And the ponds themselves do provide some refuge, not only for those animals, but also for those animals that live in the wetlands. And in fact, the fire came through at 4 p.m. that night. We had frogs calling. You
had frogs calling that night?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Just the power of the wetlands.
Yes, absolutely. And but the fact that there were patches left unburnt in those sort of areas where the swampy meadow was particularly moist meant that there were refuges during the fire.
Yes.
But the intensity of the fire as it moved through that floodplain, as it was reduced, it means that there would have been organisms in the soil, bacteria, invertebrates, frogs that were able to survive and because the fire wasn't as intense as it would have otherwise been.
And I guess then the green pit coming up after the rains did finally come through?
Yes, and so post-fire there was rapid recovery of the vegetation across the floodplain. It really bounced back very quickly, and with those permanent ponds in the system, after the fire there was water for all sorts of wildlife, but also for people. And so we had...
So I was saying, I was thinking, did you have resources for humans as well during that fire time?
Yeah, so we had fire trucks that were filling up their tanks, doing mopping up work after the fire had been through our area. So we were quite proud to be able to provide water.
Because everybody's dams were dry during that time, and the nearby rivers had gone to puddles.
So we were pretty happy to be able to provide fresh water. Yep.
So that's your story and your property. But if we look then at wetlands, sort of stepping back a bit, how then important is it to have these wetlands and how to be able to let us be resilient to fire?
Yeah, well, it definitely acted as a firebreak.
Yes,
and it's
an unusual firebreak because we think of a firebreak as a big bulldozer line.
Yes. That's right, but this firebreak was really well vegetated, full of vegetation, but still acted as a firebreak. And so I think it's really important that we think not only about how fire behaves and how we can fight fire in terms of removing vegetation, but also these sorts of environments which are full of wetlands and habitat. And so the ability of these systems to hold water and to grow this type of vegetation that contains the water, rushes and reeds, is really a function of how these areas are managed. Yeah.
So then how do we then, so if you happen to have a beautiful chain of ponds on your farm, or maybe you don't, maybe you've just got a little bit of a starter wetlands, how then can we protect them to make sure we are resilient then?
Yep.
What are things we can do?
So these systems, when they're in their intact state, act like sponges. And in the case of Back Creek, which you'll see the photos of, it's a series of wetlands, but even a wetland that is an isolated individual wetland can still have some of the characteristics that create resilience against the intensity of a bushfire. And a lot of it has to do with the sponge characteristics of these wetlands and their ability to hold moisture, not only on the surface but also in the soil profile and amongst the roots of the plants.
So it could look dry, but actually underneath it's still happening.
And in fact, just before the fire on the 10th of January that came through our wetland system on Back Creek, it looked incredibly dry and had been exposed to an extended period of really hot months and really low rainfall.
And revegetating as well. If you happen to have an area that doesn't have the lush, beautiful vegetation we can see at your place, if you have an area, can you start revegetating? That can help as well to build that resilience of that wetland?
Yes, often when we think about revegetation, we think about planting trees.
Yes.
But ground cover's really valuable and essential in these kinds of environments, absolutely. So your tall poa grasses, caryxes and lomandras, all really important in this situation. So that trying to encourage the maintenance of that sponge, taking livestock out of these areas, that sponge can gradually return over time, but also trying to ensure that evaporation is minimised. So if you've got tall vegetation like this around a wetland, it can actually help to minimise evaporation so that surface water and the surrounding saturated soils stay for longer if we've had an extended period of dry.
Which we're going to have more and more of them. And so if property owners or farmers happen to have these chain of ponds naturally on their land, like them, or happen to want to get more into looking after their river areas, can they contact the BCT? How do you guys work? Can people get in touch and say, I want to talk to you, what can I do?
Yes, absolutely. We've got a range of programs that give people opportunities to do that. So yeah, people can give us a call.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us again for Bettong Bungalow, and I hope you really enjoy seeing all the photos while we've been chatting, because it's an incredible story and one that we could talk about for hours. But thank you so much for joining me today,
Pleasure.
Donna. Thank you.